The sound of the snow shovel hitting the frozen driveway was the only thing breaking the silence that morning, until my widowed neighbor suddenly grabbed my sleeve with trembling fingers and whispered, "Don't leave yet." The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of winter. It was the kind of loneliness that had been buried beneath months of forced smiles. And in that single moment, I realized I had almost walked away from someone who wasn't asking for help with snow at all. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change lives, if you still believe in hope, forgiveness, compassion, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, leave a kind comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach hearts that may need them the most. My name is Nathan, and I had lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Aspen, Colorado, for nearly 8 years. After my divorce, I found comfort in routine. I worked remotely, kept to myself, and rarely spoke to anyone beyond a friendly wave. The only exception was my neighbor, Rebecca. She had lost her husband, Samuel, almost 2 years earlier after a sudden illness. Since then, the cheerful home that once echoed with laughter had become painfully quiet. Every Christmas, she still placed the same lights on her porch, even though no one ever came to celebrate with her. That January brought one of the heaviest snowstorms Colorado had seen in years. Cars disappeared beneath thick blankets of snow, mailboxes became tiny white hills, and most neighbors stayed indoors. When I noticed Rebecca struggling to clear her long driveway with a worn-out shovel, I grabbed mine without thinking. She smiled politely as I helped, insisting she could manage, but exhaustion showed in every movement. We worked side by side for nearly an hour, saying very little while cold winds swept across the neighborhood. When the driveway was finally clear, I leaned my shovel against the garage and wished her a warm afternoon. That was when she quietly stepped closer and whispered those unforgettable words. "Don't leave yet." Something in her voice stopped me instantly. It wasn't desperation. It was vulnerability, the kind that only appears when someone has carried too much pain alone. She invited me inside, apologizing for the mess even though the house looked spotless. The fireplace crackled softly while snowflakes drifted past the windows. Every room held reminders of Samuel. His framed photographs remained on the walls, his favorite chair still faced the television, and his old winter boots rested neatly beside the front door as though he might return at any moment. Rebecca admitted she had been pretending to be strong for everyone. Friends had gradually stopped visiting, assuming she was healing. Family lived across the country. Holidays had become unbearable. The silence inside the house had grown louder than any storm outside. She confessed that she had almost convinced herself nobody would notice if she simply disappeared from everyone's daily routine, not because she wanted harm, but because she felt forgotten. Her words stayed with me long after I returned home that evening. I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it is to overlook invisible loneliness. We notice broken fences, icy sidewalks, and overflowing mailboxes, but we often miss broken hearts hiding behind neatly decorated front porches. The next morning, I baked fresh cinnamon bread using my late grandmother's recipe and carried it next door. Rebecca laughed for the first time in months after admitting she had completely forgotten how wonderful homemade bread smelled. That small visit turned into coffee. Coffee became weekly dinners. Soon other neighbors noticed the lights on again and began stopping by with soup, desserts, board games, and stories about Samuel that made everyone laugh instead of cry. One evening, Rebecca opened an old wooden chest filled with letters her husband had written throughout their marriage. Instead of locking them away again, she read one aloud. It wasn't filled with grand promises. It simply reminded her that love was never measured by how long someone stayed, but by how deeply they changed the lives around them. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but for the first time they were mixed with gratitude instead of hopelessness. Inspired by those evenings, Rebecca suggested organizing a neighborhood winter supper every month for anyone living alone. Widowers, widows, retired veterans, young professionals far from family, and elderly couples all began gathering in her home. What started as one whispered plea not to leave became an entire community refusing to leave anyone behind. Months later, spring arrived, melting the towering snowbanks that had once separated every house. Flowers replaced ice, laughter replaced silence, and Rebecca's home became the warmest place on the street. She still missed Samuel every day, but she no longer carried that grief by herself. Instead, his memory became the reason others found belonging. Before we reach the end, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment and tell us about someone whose simple act of kindness changed your life, or someone you hope to thank someday. Your story may become the encouragement another viewer desperately needs today. As I stood on my porch one peaceful evening, watching neighbors gather for another shared meal, I realized that clearing snow had never been the real task. The real work had been clearing the loneliness that had quietly settled over a human heart. Sometimes people don't need perfect answers. They don't need expensive gifts or dramatic rescues. Sometimes they simply need someone willing to stay a little longer. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking the video, sharing it with family and friends, and subscribing for more stories that remind us kindness is never wasted. Because the smallest decision to remain beside someone can become the greatest gift they receive and the greatest blessing we never expected to find ourselves.